Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom, the Autobiography of Nelson Mandela. Long Walk to Freedom narrates the astounding life of Nelson Mandela, an iconic figure who triumphed over adversity to become one of the world's greatest leaders. Born in a small village in South Africa, Mandela's life was molded by his Xhosa tribe's culture and his exposure to British colonial rule. His remarkable journey took him from a rural upbringing to a legal career fighting for the rights of Africans, and membership in the African National Congress, ANC. Eventually, Mandela played a pivotal role in dismantling apartheid as he spent decades in prison, only to emerge stronger and more focused than ever before.
Mandela, a life of enlightened rebellion. A true icon, Nelson Mandela was born in 1918, in the South African village of Mvizo, among the Xhosa tribe known for upholding the principles of law, courtesy, and education. His birth name, Ralilola, fittingly translates to troublemaker in the Xhosa language. Although his father held the title of a tribal chief, British influence greatly diminished the power and authority associated with Mandela's royal lineage. Mandela's father eventually lost his chieftainship, and when he passed away, another regent, John Jintaba, took young Mandela under his wing. Observing tribal meetings and engaging with influential figures like Chief Joy, Mandela immersed himself in understanding the struggles of his people under European colonial rule. Chief Joy's lessons recounted the tribe's harmonious coexistence until the arrival of white settlers, whose greed for land disrupted tribal unity. Later in life, Mandela found that Joy's lessons may not have been entirely accurate, but they still had a lasting impact, shaping his awareness of social injustice and fueling his quest to battle oppression. Mandela's early journey. Young Mandela, an introverted lover of physical activities, paved his path to greatness through education and challenging authority. Beginning as the first in his family to attend school, he emerged as an advocate for his fellow students, laying the foundation for his future revolutionary spirit. Born into a world that heavily revolved around British influence, Mandela's education featured solely British history, culture, and institutions, with African culture remaining absent from the curriculum. In fact, it was customary for Africans to adopt anglicized names, with Mandela's teacher bestowing upon him the name Nelson, perhaps inspired by the renowned British sea captain Lord Nelson. Outside of the classroom, he learned about African history through the regent's court elders. As a bright and resourceful youth, Mandela graduated from Hilltown College with his junior certificate in 2 years rather than the typical 3. In 1937, he pursued English, anthropology, politics, native administration, and law at Fort Hare College. It was here Mandela's knack for challenging authority took root. Together with his peers, Mandela successfully campaigned for freshman representation on the House Committee by leveraging the strong support of fellow students. However, his defiance didn't always result in triumph. The following year, Mandela faced expulsion for siding with a student boycott. Undeterred, he left Fort Hare and journeyed to Johannesburg, ready to embark on the next chapter of his extraordinary life. The blend of his diligent pursuit of education and the courage to speak up against unfair systems fueled the fire within him, setting the stage for the iconic leader he would become. Mandela's journey to activism. Arriving in Johannesburg in 1941, Nelson Mandela's initial experience as a night watchman in a gold mine exposed him to the harsh reality of white oppression. Aspiring to be a lawyer, he met Walter Sisulu, who helped him secure a clerk position at a law firm and pursue a law degree. Mandela, influenced by his colleague Gower Radebe and inspired by the African National Congress, ANC, embarked on his political journey. His connections with fellow activists and participation in a bus boycott against rising fares ignited his dedication to fighting apartheid. When Nelson Mandela first set foot in Johannesburg in 1941, the city was bustling with activity. Little did he know, it was here that he would forge lifelong friendships and join the fight against oppression. Mandela's initial job as night watchman in a gold mine exhibited the overwhelming power and greed of white oppressors, as thousands of Africans were forced to toil for their benefit. Mandela's true aspiration, however, was to become a lawyer. His cousin introduced him to Walter Sisulu, a man who would become not only a close friend but also a guiding force in his life. Sisulu helped Mandela secure a position as a clerk in a prominent law firm and pursue his law degree at the University of South Africa. It was during this time that he crossed paths with Gour Radebe, his colleague and the only other black employee at the firm. Radebe, a key member of the African National Congress (ANC), introduced Mandela to the organization, whose mission was to achieve full citizenship for all South Africans. Under Radebe's influence, Mandela became immersed in the ANC and its quest for change. He first put his political beliefs into action in 1943 during a bus boycott protest against skyrocketing fares. This boycott marked a turning point in Mandela's life. He was no longer just a spectator, but an active participant. Marching alongside his fellow South Africans proved both exhilarating and empowering. As his political convictions grew, Mandela formed connections with fellow activists like Tony O'Dowd, Harold Wolpe, and members of the Communist Party. These important relationships would become the foundation of his later fight against apartheid, strengthening his resolve in the face of adversity. Uniting against apartheid. Johannesburg's Walter Sisulu's home became a meeting place for African National Congress (ANC) members and intellectuals, including Anton Lembede, a lawyer advocating for African unity and reclaiming the land. He believed this would counteract the shame from Western influences. Mandela, Sisulu, Lembede, and others convinced the ANC leader, Dr. Shuma, to create a youth league in 1944. In 1948, Dr. Daniel Malan's National Party, promoting apartheid, won the general election. Mandela and the Youth League organized a national day of protest, gaining public support and expanding the ANC's membership. During the early days of the African National Congress, Walter Sisulu's home in Johannesburg became a gathering space for forward-thinking African intellectuals. One of these individuals was Anton Lembede, a lawyer whose influential ideas centered around the belief that Africa should belong to its black population. Lembede emphasized the importance of African unity among all tribes to reclaim their land and culture, which he believed was the key to eradicating a pervasive sense of inferiority tied to Western ideals. The passion for change inspired Nelson Mandela, Sisulu, Lembede, and others to approach Dr. Shuma, the current ANC leader. They urged him to establish a youth league that could mobilize support for their cause. Although initially doubtful of their ability to organize the African masses, Shuma agreed to form the league in 1944. Less than 4 years later, in 1948, Dr. Daniel Malan's National Party stunningly seized victory in the general election. Malan and his party campaigned on a platform of apartheid, an Afrikaans term meaning apartness, using shameful racist slogans to achieve political gains. Immediately upon taking power, Malan put apartheid laws into action, starting with the Group Areas Act, which mandated separate living spaces for racial groups. Not accepting defeat, Mandela and the Youth League counterattacked. Together, they organized a national day of protest, encouraging African workers to stay home as a symbolic act of defiance. This bold event took place on June 26, 1950, and bolstered both the anti-apartheid movement and Mandela's dedication to the cause. Their efforts, along with the Defiance Campaign, led to a surge in ANC membership, from a modest number to over 100,000 within a single year. Rebellion against rising oppression. The National Day of Protest highlighted the growing power struggle between the African National Congress, ANC, and the National Party as apartheid intensified. With Mandela arrested under the Suppression of Communism Act, the resistance had to evolve. Mandela continued his work, providing legal support for oppressed Africans, while contemplating the necessity of violence as an answer to the increasingly harsh laws imposed by the National Party. Emerging from the National Day of Protest, both the African National Congress, ANC, and the National Party found themselves at a pivotal point in their battle for control. The National Party responded by enacting the Suppression of Communism Act, a tool they quickly employed to target Nelson Mandela, one of the protest organizers. Arrested on June 30, 1950, Mandela and his co-accused faced massive public support, evidenced by the demonstrations in Johannesburg during their court hearings. Nevertheless, they were found guilty of statutory communism and received suspended prison sentences. Undeterred, Mandela proceeded to establish a law firm in August of 1952, focusing on supporting Africans impacted by the increasingly discriminatory policies of apartheid. The mounting restrictions, such as segregated public facilities and transportation, created a desperate need for legal assistance among the African population. Mandela's passionate defiance in court, like the acquittal of a black maid accused of theft, exemplified his determination to challenge the oppressive status quo. As the National Party continued to pass ever more draconian laws, Mandela and fellow activist Walter Sisulu began questioning if violent resistance was the only recourse. Sisulu's clandestine attempt to request weapons from China, however, sparked an intense debate on the use of violence within the ANC leadership. This era marked a critical juncture in Mandela's life, as well as the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. The growing realization that their peaceful resistance might not be sufficient to counteract the oppression led to new, previously unimaginable paths for Mandela and the ANC. Mandela's Treason Trial. On December 5, 1956, Nelson Mandela was arrested and accused of high treason for his alleged involvement in planning violent acts during the Defiance campaign. Alongside Mandela, other leaders of the campaign were arrested as well. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the questionable testimony of a fraud convict, Solomon Ngubase. However, the defense discredited Ngubase during cross-examination, proving he lied about his involvement with the ANC and educational background. Meanwhile, the situation outside the courtroom escalated, with the tragic incident in Sharpeville invoking widespread protests and a government-declared state of emergency. Despite the havoc outside, the court case ultimately ended in favor of Mandela and the other accused leaders, as the judge ruled the evidence insufficient and acquitted them all. Unmasking Mandela's secret militancy. While Nelson Mandela and his friends were imprisoned, they realized it was time for the African National Congress, ANC, to covertly shift tactics. Despite ongoing violence debates, the ANC maintained an official non-violence policy, but allowed Mandela to create a militant wing named Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, or the Spear of the Nation. MK initially employed sabotage, with Mandela studying guerrilla warfare, explosives, and revolution. He operated from Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg that served as a safe house and training ground. In December 1960, MK detonated bombs in government buildings and power stations in Johannesburg, subsequently releasing a manifesto announcing their existence. The South African government, taken aback, intensified their countermeasures. Capturing the iconic Mandela. The government's determination to capture Nelson Mandela finally paid off on August 5, 1962, as he was arrested and imprisoned. In court, Mandela boldly expressed his defiance and disinterest in following the government's unjust laws. Despite having strong evidence against him, the prosecution was unable to push for the death penalty due to international pressure, resulting in his life imprisonment sentence. Once an icon of South Africa's resistance movement, Nelson Mandela's capture on August 5, 1962 marked a turning point. He was arrested on his way back from a secret meeting at Lily's Leaf Farm and later joined by fellow activist, Sisulu. Donning traditional Xhosa garb, Mandela entered the courtroom with a determined spirit. Unwilling to be morally bound by laws passed by a parliament that he couldn't vote for, he boldly stated his intent to put the government on trial. Mandela detailed the government's dismissal of the African National Congress's, ANC, peaceful efforts, resulting in their resort to violence. Facing damning evidence, including a document that explicitly implicated him and his comrades, Mandela's guilt was indisputable. Nevertheless, global outpouring of support and international pressure, including UN experts advocating for amnesty, saved Mandela from the death penalty. Instead, the iconic leader was sentenced to life in prison on June 12, 1964, steering South Africa towards a new path of resistance. Resilience on Robben Island. Mandela spent 20 grueling years on Robben Island, where prisoners faced harsh conditions, strict controls, and a heartbreaking disconnect from the outside world, including their families. Solitary confinement was a dreaded risk for even minor infractions. To maintain morale and emotional strength, prisoners sought ways to resist and overcome oppression. Mandela challenged unfair treatment, and the prisoners initiated hunger strikes to fight for change. Despite the challenges, prisoners managed to access books and magazines, occasionally outsmarting the guards. Courage, resilience, and resistance enabled Mandela and his fellow inmates to withstand the inhumane prison conditions, stirring the spirit of rebellion that would eventually lead to their victory. Rising tide of resistance. As the 1970s unfolded, the guards at Robben Island loosened their stringent behavior, yet the external conditions continued to deteriorate. Despite this, the decade saw mass protests swelling across Africa and a fiery new breed of freedom fighters taking up the mantle. In 1976, Mandela and his fellow inmates caught wind of an uprising when 15,000 schoolchildren in Soweto protested the use of Afrikaans in their education. The brutal police response to the assembly led to international outrage and an explosion of riots across South Africa. The newer generation of freedom fighters adopted a more militant stance, with many joining the Black consciousness movement that aimed to demolish the Black community's feelings of inferiority. While Mandela respected their determination, he disagreed with their exclusive focus on race. The uprisings of the late 1970s caught the world's eye, and "Free Mandela" campaigns emerged globally. In 1980, a Johannesburg newspaper feature prompted a nationwide discussion about Mandela's release, illustrating the growing impact of these anti-apartheid efforts. Path to peaceful negotiations. As violence escalated in the early 1980s, Nelson Mandela recognized the urgent need for negotiations to prevent further chaos. Despite the African National Congress's (ANC) refusal to negotiate with the apartheid government, Mandela took the initiative and reached out to the Minister of Defense, Kobie Coetsee, in 1986, prompting their first meeting. This paved the way for a series of secret discussions between Mandela and a committee of state officials in 1988. In December 1989, F.W. de Klerk, the new president who was devoted to peace, met with Mandela and attentively considered the latter's proposals. Eventually, in February 1990, de Klerk announced he would lift the ban on the ANC and release all political prisoners involved in non-violent activities. With this decision, Mandela was informed of his impending release, marking a turning point in South African history. Mandela's Road to Freedom. Nelson Mandela, released in 1990, took the first steps to freedom with South African citizens closely following. From a low-security prison outside Cape Town, Mandela cautiously re-emerged into the public eye. On the day of his release, he famously raised his fist, chanting, "Amandla," a Xhosa word for power. Conversely, the crowd replied, "Ngawathu," meaning, "to us." This exchange signified South African solidarity during those turbulent times. Mandela pledged his loyalty to the African National Congress, ANC, remaining steadfast in his beliefs that peace could be achieved in South Africa through diligent negotiations. Despite the complicated relationship between the government and ANC, both parties engaged in secret talks, eventually agreeing on proportional representation in the cabinet for parties obtaining over 5% in the general elections. This decision demanded cooperation between ANC and the National Party, igniting a wave of controversy within the ANC itself. South Africa's transformation was ultimately realized in 1994, when the first non-racialized election took place, garnering 62.6% of votes for the ANC. Mandela received the Nobel Peace Prize shortly after the historic event, signifying progress towards equality in the region.
Overcoming seemingly insurmountable struggles, Nelson Mandela's unwavering determination to fight for a just and equal society made him a formidable leader, and a symbol of hope. The journey detailed in Long Walk to Freedom depicts the harsh realities of apartheid, the power of resistance, and the importance of unity among people. Through the story of Mandela's life, we learn invaluable lessons on resilience, the significance of education, and the role of each individual in the pursuit of justice and equality. His legacy continues to inspire us to take action and work towards a better, more inclusive world.